Good morning, students. Today we will study transport of gases. Till now, we studied introduction of respiratory system and structure of respiratory organs and process of breathing under normal conditions. Right? And we studied diffusion of gases at two places, like between alveoli and blood, and between blood and tissues, right? And we today we study the transport of gases. Gases means oxygen and carbon dioxide. As we know, during inhalation, we take air into lungs. Air goes to alveoli. In the alveoli, what happens? The oxygen present in the alveoli diffuse into the blood. Okay. And similarly, the carbon dioxide present in the blood diffuse into the alveoli. This is exchange of gases between alveoli and blood. And what happens after diffusion of oxygen into the blood? The diffused oxygen will be transported to the tissues by the blood. This is oxygen transport. Particularly in the cells, due to the catabolic activities, due to the oxidation of food material, carbon dioxide is produced. The produced carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood from the cells, and this diffused carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs for elimination. This is called carbon dioxide transport. So here we study the oxygen transport and carbon dioxide transport. Oxygen is transported from lungs to tissues, and carbon dioxide transported from tissues to lungs. Right? So this transport of gases is important for IPE examination and important for 4 marks. Okay. First we study the transport of oxygen. Simply remember, the oxygen transported from lungs to tissues by two means. Number one is 3% of carbon dioxide is transported from lungs to tissues as a dissolved state. That means simply 3% of carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood. Blood contains the plasma. Plasma is nothing but water. That means 3% of oxygen diffuses into the blood and dissolves in the plasma, means it dissolves in the water, and it's same as a dissolved state. 3% of carbon dioxide is transported to the tissues. Simple. And the second one, 97% of oxygen is transported by the blood, particularly with the help of hemoglobin. That means 97% of oxygen diffuses into the blood and binds with the hemoglobin and forms a complex substance called oxyhemoglobin. In the form of oxyhemoglobin, this 97% of oxygen is transported to the tissues. Okay, here we should know about hemoglobin. What is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a respiratory pigment. It is a red colored pigment which is present in the RBC cells, right? Particularly hemoglobin contains two parts. One is the heme and second one is the globin. Heme means it contains a metal which is known as the iron. And globin is a protein part. This heme, globin together called as hemoglobin. Particularly here, the heme of the hemoglobin combines with the oxygen and forms the oxyhemoglobin. Right? Particularly in the hemoglobin molecule, there are 4 heme molecules are there. That's why each hemoglobin molecule can bind with 4 oxygen molecules. Right? And particularly here you can see the equation. Hemoglobin, right? Here you can see this is the hemoglobin. This hemoglobin binding with 4 oxygen molecules and forms the oxyhemoglobin. And simply remember, this reaction is this reaction is reversible reaction. Reversible reaction. That means hemoglobin binds with the oxygen and forms the oxyhemoglobin, and this oxyhemoglobin can dissociates into oxygen and hemoglobin. So this is the reversible reaction, right? Particularly at the lungs, at the alveoli, hemoglobin oxygen forms the oxyhemoglobin, but in the tissues, this oxyhemoglobin dissociates into oxygen and hemoglobin. The dissociated oxygen diffuses into the tissues, right? This is the transport of oxygen. Very simple. The oxygen is transported by 2 methods. Number 1 is as a dissolved state. Particularly 3% of oxygen is transported from alveoli to the tissues as a dissolved state. The second one is by oxyhemoglobin. 97% of oxygen diffuses into the blood and combines with the hemoglobin of RBC cells and forms the oxyhemoglobin. Right? But here you should remember that at the alveoli, hemoglobin binds with oxygen and forms the oxyhemoglobin. In the tissues, at the tissues, oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen. Right? This is the reversible reaction. Already I told you. But here you should remember the binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin is decided or affected by 4 factors. Okay, that means there are 4 factors which decides the binding of oxygen with the hemoglobin. What are the 4 factors? Number 1 is partial pressure of oxygen, that means PO2, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that is PCO2, and hydrogen ion concentration, nothing but pH, and temperature. So these 4 factors decides the affinity of oxygen with the hemoglobin. Let us see in clearly. Okay. In the alveoli, what happens? At the alveoli, what happens? Oxygen diffuses into the blood, combines with the hemoglobin, forms the oxyhemoglobin. Okay. What are the conditions at the alveoli? At the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is high. Right? Particularly in the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen will be 104. In the blood, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40. That's why oxygen diffuses into the blood. Okay. That means you should remember that the where partial pressure of oxygen is high, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, and the hydrogen concentration is low, and the temperature is low, there oxygen binds with the hemoglobin and forms the oxyhemoglobin. But when it comes to the tissues, the place where the partial pressure of oxygen is low and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high and the pH is high and the temperature is high, these conditions favors the dissociation of oxyhemoglobin. Understood? And what does it mean? In the tissues, oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen, and this dissociated oxygen diffuses into the cells. Got it? That means the place where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, there hemoglobin combines with the oxygen. The place where partial pressure of oxygen is low, there oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen. Due to this nature, oxyhemoglobin keeps on transporting the oxygen from lungs to tissues. But here you should remember that not only partial pressure of oxygen, other factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, pH and temperature, these factors also decides the transportation of oxygen by hemoglobin. Right now, in other words, we can say the place where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, there oxygen combines with the hemoglobin. The place where partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, there oxygen do not binds with the hemoglobin. Instead, oxyhemoglobin delivers the oxygen. Oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen. Right? This is the transport of oxygen. And particularly you should remember, every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can transport about 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under normal conditions. Understood? Every 100 ml of blood transports about 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues. Okay. Here you can see these RBC cells. This is the RBC cells. Here oxygen means this blue bubbles enters into the RBC. When they enters the RBC, combines with the hemoglobin, and oxyhemoglobin is formed. When in the tissues, what is happening? The oxygen is going outside, is coming outside, is diffusing into the tissues. And what does that mean? In the tissues, partial pressure of oxygen is low, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, temperature is high, pH is high. That's why hemoglobin is giving away oxygen. Okay, and that means oxygen goes to the tissues. But here, what is happening at the alveoli? At the alveoli, partial pressure of oxygen is high, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, temperature is low, pH is low. That's why what is happening? Oxygen entering into the blood, enters the RBC, combines with the hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin is formed. Right? Okay. And here we also study about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Understand? Here you can see a curve. It is a curve which is the sigmoid curve, which is S in shape. This sigmoid curve can be obtained by plotting partial pressure of oxygen with the percentage of saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Here one term comes, saturation. Simply remember, I told you hemoglobin contains 4 heme units. Each heme unit can bind with one oxygen molecule. That means hemoglobin having 4 hemes, that's why a hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules. Right? Okay. Suppose if hemoglobin combined with the 4 oxygen molecules, then it is called 100% saturated. Okay. Suppose if hemoglobin binds with only 2 oxygen molecules, then it is called as 50% saturated. If it is only combined with 1 oxygen molecule, then it is known as 25% saturated. Understood? This saturation of hemoglobin is completely depends on the partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration and temperature. Already you might have got idea when the saturation of hemoglobin increases. Try to tell me, guess. The saturation of hemoglobin increases. That means binding of oxygen with hemoglobin increases where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, pH and temperatures are low. Okay, where these conditions are present? These conditions are present at alveoli. That's why hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin is formed. Okay, but at the tissues, low means less partial pressure of oxygen, high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and high temperature, high pH. Due to these conditions, what happens? Oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen. Means oxyhemoglobin is dissociating means, what does that mean? The saturation of hemoglobin is decreasing. Suppose a oxyhemoglobin delivers 1 oxygen, then the saturation of hemoglobin comes to 100 to 75. If it delivers another oxygen, it comes to the 100 to 50%. If it delivers a third oxygen, it comes to the 25%. That means at the tissues, saturation of hemoglobin decreases. At the alveoli, saturation of hemoglobin increases. That means you can simply remember, with the increase of partial pressure of oxygen, the saturation of hemoglobin increases. Remember, at 100 millimeters Hg of oxygen partial pressure, the hemoglobin is 97% saturated. 97% saturated. That means almost all fully saturated. When this happen, the place where the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters. That means this is present at alveoli. Let we study it. At the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104. That means almost 100, 104. That means what happens at the alveoli? Hemoglobin is saturated. Okay. After saturation means what? Combine with the oxygen, combines with the hemoglobin. After saturation, the saturated hemoglobin, when it comes to the tissues, in the tissues what happens? The partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeters. That means low oxygen partial pressure. At this, the oxyhemoglobin delivers. Oxyhemoglobin gives away the oxygen. Oxyhemoglobin leaves the oxygen. So this left oxygen diffuses into the tissues. What does that mean? The saturation of hemoglobin decreases. Right? Right now. So here you can understand at high oxygen partial pressure, more saturation of hemoglobin occurs. At low partial pressure of oxygen, less hemoglobin is saturated. In other words, we can also say that at low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, at low temperature, at low hydrogen ion concentration, the percentage of hemoglobin saturation increases. That means that occurs in the alveoli. The place where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, temperature is high, and hydrogen ion concentration is high, there oxyhemoglobin dissociates. That means the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve moves from left to right. Right now. Let me tell you, suppose with the increasing of oxygen partial pressure, the curve goes up, means saturation of hemoglobin increases. Right? If suppose the partial pressure of oxygen is low, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, what happens? This dissociation curve moves from left to right. Left to right. Here two more question I will tell you, important one. There is a scientist called Bohr. Bohr explained that due to the effect of carbon dioxide, due to the effect of partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve moves from left to right. So this phenomenon is known as Bohr effect. Understood? In simple language, we can say that the effect of partial pressure of carbon, this effect of carbon dioxide on saturation of hemoglobin is called Bohr effect. Understood? Simple no. Suppose if there is a more carbon dioxide is there, hemoglobin loses oxygen, combines with the carbon dioxide. Why? Because there is a more affinity of carbon dioxide towards the hemoglobin. Okay, and that means here you can understand two things. Number one is the place where more oxygen, means more partial pressure of oxygen is there hemoglobin combines with the oxygen. The place where less oxygen, less partial pressure of oxygen is there, then oxyhemoglobin dissociates. In other words, we can also say that the place where less carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, there hemoglobin combines with oxygen. Okay, the place where more carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, there oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen. Right? Okay. I hope you understood this. This is the transport of oxygen. Right? Simple. Suppose if transport of oxygen is asked under 4 marks in IP examination, simple. You have to explain the 2 methods of oxygen transport, and you also write about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Right? Okay. This is all for this day, and tomorrow we will study about the carbon dioxide transport. And here, before I end this session, I would like to tell you one more important thing. I told you at the alveoli, hemoglobin combines with the oxygen, forms the oxyhemoglobin. This reaction is a reversible reaction, means it occurs in the left way as well as in the right way, right? At the tissues, oxyhemoglobin dissociates into hemoglobin and oxygen, right? But remember, at the tissues, the oxyhemoglobin is not completely unsaturated. Unsaturated means hemoglobin do not delivers complete oxygen to the tissues. Already told you, at 100 millimeters of Hg, hemoglobin is 97% saturated. But at the tissues where the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeters Hg, there the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. What does that mean? At the alveoli means 100 millimeters, 97% saturated. At the tissues means 40 millimeters, 75% saturated. That means 22% of oxygen is unloaded from the blood to the tissues. This means 22% of oxygen dissociated from the oxyhemoglobin and supplies to the cells. Okay. And one more thing. That means 75% of oxygen always present in the blood by combining with the hemoglobin. Understood? And this 75% of oxygen, which always remains in the blood, is useful to survive 4 to 5 minutes when our breathing interrupts or whenever our heart stops functioning. Understood? This is very good thing. Suppose if our heart stops working, we can be alive for 4 to 5 minutes due to presence of oxygen in the blood. Understood? Suppose if you are doing some exercise, if you are running, at that time more amount of oxygen is unloaded from the blood. Okay, during exercise conditions, blood delivers about 35% of oxygen to the tissues. 35%. That means about 60% of oxygen remains in the blood. Okay, that means you should remember that the oxygen always keeps on transporting the oxygen from the hemoglobin transports oxygen from alveoli to the tissues basing on 4 factors: PO2, PCO2, H plus ion concentration and temperature. Right? Okay. So I will end this class today. After listening to this class, just you go through the textbook if you have, so that you can understand very well. And don't hesitate to call me if you have any doubt or queries about this topic. Right? And we are also giving textbooks from library. You can come to the college. We are in the college from 10 to 4 p.m. As soon as your online classes are over, you can come in the afternoon. You can collect the books from the library. Okay. Have a good day. Bye.